What would you do if your own brother, the man who once stood beside you through every royal ceremony, every public appearance, and every whisper of the world's gossip, suddenly fell to his knees in front of you, pleading for a second chance? Imagine Prince Harry, the prince who captured hearts across the globe, the younger son whose life had been meticulously chronicled from the moment he took his first steps on palace grounds, now reduced to a figure of desperate vulnerability. Picture him there, voice trembling, eyes glistening with the weight of regrets and unspoken fears, hands clasped as if clinging to the very air that connected him to the brother he once trusted. The image itself is enough to stop the heart, but what came next would send shockwaves not just through the walls of Buckingham Palace, but across the world, stirring conversations in every corner of the globe, igniting speculation, judgment, and disbelief in equal measure. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This isn't a story about tabloids or the surface-level drama of royal feuds. This is about the collision of ambition, desperation, and legacy. It's about the precise moment where family loyalty clashes with duty, where a brother's plea for redemption is met not with compassion, but with a decision so calculated, so shocking, it would redefine the path of an entire dynasty. You might think you know what happened next, but trust me, you don't. There are twists hidden in plain sight, choices made in shadows, and consequences that stretch far beyond any palace wall. Let's rewind. Prince Harry's life had never been simple. From the moment he was born into the glare of public attention, every smile, every frown, every milestone had been scrutinized, dissected, and broadcast to millions. Yet, for all the privilege and all the adoration, there was a growing strain, a sense of confinement, and a desire to step away from the suffocating gaze of the monarchy. That decision, of course, became the defining turning point. Megxit, the world would call it. The unprecedented step of leaving royal duties while keeping titles sparked fury, curiosity, and intense media scrutiny. Harry was no longer a prince in the traditional sense. He was a man trying to reclaim his life, his autonomy, and his family on his own terms. But what few realized was that stepping away didn't erase expectations, it only shifted the battlefield. Meanwhile, Prince William, the heir apparent, the future king, watched every move. His role wasn't just ceremonial, it was protective, strategic, and laden with the burden of continuity. William had learned early that being a royal meant mastering the art of perception, what the public saw, what the world remembered, and what the family chose to reveal. Behind closed doors, he observed, calculated, and sometimes quietly judged. Harry's departure, while a personal choice, represented a fracture in the very foundation William had been groomed to uphold. The younger brother's choices had consequences, not just for him, but for the monarchy itself. And William, ever the strategic thinker, knew this. He knew that a desperate Harry, pleading for reinstatement, wasn't merely asking for a second chance. He was testing boundaries, challenging authority, and forcing William into a corner. What happened next was almost cinematic. The palace staff whispered about it for weeks. Aides who witnessed the private encounters were sworn to silence, and yet the tension was palpable. Harry's knees were on the cold marble, his voice cracking as he begged for a return to duty, to the life he had left behind, to a sense of belonging he feared he had lost forever. And William? He didn't rush to answer. He allowed the silence to stretch, the weight of expectation pressing down like a physical force. Every second that passed was calculated. Was it cruelty? Was it strategy? Was it a test of loyalty? Or was it something even more intricate, something that would ultimately shock the world when the final decision came? You might be asking yourself, how did it come to this? How does a brotherly bond, once so publicly cherished, dissolve into a moment of desperate pleading? The answer lies in years of accumulation. The slight misunderstandings, the unspoken resentments, the choices made on very public stages, and the pressures of living under the gaze of millions. It's about family, yes, but it's also about legacy, public perception, and the harsh reality of what it means to be part of an institution that demands perfection, poise, and unquestioned loyalty. The cracks had been forming for years, subtle yet undeniable, until finally they widened into a chasm that Harry could no longer ignore. Yet even in this moment of apparent vulnerability, there's a layer most observers miss. Harry wasn't simply asking for forgiveness. He was presenting a proposal, a calculated plea, and a challenge wrapped in desperation. Every word, every gesture was a strategic move. And William, with decades of training and a mind honed for both diplomacy and survival, recognized it immediately. He understood the stakes, the optics, and the potential fallout. And so, the scene played out like a masterclass in tension, with both brothers locked in a silent duel of wills, their shared history colliding with the relentless machinery of monarchy. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. The public had no idea. The world saw headlines, snippets of interviews, the occasional staged photograph, but nothing could capture the gravity, the intimacy, or the quiet terror of that room. And what William decided, what he ultimately chose to do in that exact moment, would ripple outward, affecting not only Harry but the entire royal institution, his own legacy, and the perception of monarchy for years to come. You might be thinking, surely it couldn't have been that dramatic. Surely, this is just another royal spat blown out of proportion. But think again. In the months leading up to this pivotal moment, private aides documented whispered threats, sudden shifts in loyalty among key advisors, and a cascade of communications that revealed just how high the stakes had climbed. And then came the letters, the conversations Harry thought were private, and the strategic moves William executed with precision that left seasoned courtiers astounded. Every decision, every gesture, carried weight far beyond what even the family could have imagined. And this brings us to the very question at the heart of this story. What would you do if your brother, once inseparable from you, begged for a chance to walk in your footsteps again? Could you forgive? Could you trust? Or would you make a choice that prioritizes legacy over love, duty over sentiment? That choice, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely what we are about to explore in a narrative filled with shocking revelations, clandestine meetings, and family dynamics so tense they could rival the plots of the most gripping dramas ever written. By the end of this story, you'll understand not just what happened in that fateful room, but why it matters now more than ever. You'll see the delicate interplay of power, desperation, and strategic thinking. You'll witness the emotional fallout, the hidden alliances, and the moments of sheer unpredictability that define the events leading up to and following Harry's desperate plea. And trust me, what William decided next is something no one saw coming. So, stay with me, because the moment you thought you understood the royal family, the moment you thought Harry's choices had predictable outcomes, everything is about to be turned on its head. Secrets will be revealed, tensions will explode, and one brother's decision will define not just the present, but the future of the monarchy itself. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What would drive a man who once held the world's admiration to collapse into desperation, his knees pressing against the cold marble of a palace floor, his hands clutching at the air like lifelines? Prince Harry, the younger son who had captivated hearts with his charm, his rebellious streak, and his very human flaws, found himself in that exact position. But this wasn't a moment born from whimsy or impulsive drama. It was the culmination of years of tension, public scrutiny, private struggles, and the unrelenting pressure of a life that was never really his own. Picture the room. Not the grand halls filled with tapestries and golden chandeliers that the world has come to expect from Buckingham Palace, but a smaller, quieter room, one that has seen whispered confessions, unspoken judgments, and the quiet plotting of dynastic power. The air was thick with expectation, silence punctuated by the soft ticking of an ornate clock. Harry had requested this meeting with William, not as a casual conversation between brothers, but as a plea for reinstatement, an attempt to reclaim a role he had abandoned, a life he had left behind in pursuit of freedom. The irony of the moment was palpable. Here was a man who had once been seen as bold, brash, and unshakable, now reduced to a figure of vulnerability. Every inch of his body seemed to convey his desperation, shoulders slumped, gaze fixed on the floor, voice trembling despite the careful control he had cultivated over years of media exposure. And yet, there was still defiance, a spark of the Harry everyone thought they knew, the prince who had always refused to be fully contained by tradition or expectation. William sat across from him, calm, poised, and utterly still. The future king had been trained his entire life to manage appearances, to control perception, to navigate every potential crisis with a blend of authority and subtlety. And now, he was faced with a brother who was begging not for forgiveness, but for validation, for a return to a life that William had meticulously maintained and protected. Every second that passed stretched the tension, making the air almost tangible. Courtiers and aides, discreetly positioned outside the room, spoke later of how even the smallest shift, a hand resting on a desk, a subtle narrowing of the eyes, felt monumental, as though they were witnessing history in real time. Harry's words began in a whisper, tentative and almost apologetic. He spoke of mistakes, of missteps, of the yearning to be part of the royal family once more. He didn't just ask for permission. He pleaded for understanding, for a chance to demonstrate loyalty, for reassurance that he still had a place among the monarchy. And every phrase was loaded, not just with emotion, but with strategy. This was not a simple apology. It was a carefully constructed appeal, a mixture of humility and subtle persuasion designed to make William question the choices he had made, to make him feel both responsible and powerless. The tension between the brothers was almost theatrical in its intensity. William, who had always been measured and deliberate, responded with silence at first, a silence so heavy that it seemed to amplify Harry's desperation. There was no immediate answer, no comforting words, no familial concession. Just the quiet, the stillness, the unyielding gaze of a man who understood the stakes and had no intention of giving in lightly. The silence forced Harry to continue, to reveal more of his fears, his regrets, and his hopes, almost as if speaking were the only way to prevent the moment from slipping away entirely. As Harry's plea unfolded, the underlying dynamics became clearer. This was a man asking not just for a return to duties, but for reinstatement into a system he had previously rejected, a system defined by protocol, hierarchy, and the unrelenting scrutiny of the public and press alike. The implications were enormous. Reintegrating Harry would not only involve logistical challenges, but would send ripples through the monarchy's image, potentially undermining years of careful management and raising questions about consistency, authority, and familial unity. Every word Harry spoke had to be weighed against these realities, and William understood them all too well. And yet, Harry was not entirely alone in this struggle. He had allies, advisors, and confidants who had encouraged him to seek reconciliation, to attempt a return to the royal fold. They had framed it as an opportunity to heal, to demonstrate personal growth, and to realign with the institution that had once defined him. But what they may not have fully grasped, and what Harry was only beginning to confront, was that this was not a simple negotiation of roles. It was a test of trust, loyalty, and control. William's response, whatever it would be, had the potential to reshape not just Harry's life, but the monarchy's narrative in the public eye. The psychological tension in the room was palpable. Harry's repeated appeals, delivered with raw honesty and measured emotion, seemed to press against an invisible wall. William's calm, deliberate posture suggested a man who had mastered the art of patience, who understood that power often lies in restraint, and that every reaction carries weight far beyond the immediate moment. Courtiers who later recounted the scene described a quiet intensity, as if every heartbeat, every word, every breath were part of a high-stakes chess game where the consequences of a single move could echo for years. And then, the moment of near collapse. Harry, realizing that his words alone were insufficient, leaned forward, placing both hands on the desk that separated him from his brother. His voice cracked, a raw mixture of frustration and vulnerability, a plea not just for reinstatement, but for recognition, for validation, for the acknowledgement that he still mattered, that his role, however unconventional, was still relevant. The desperation was tangible, and in that instant, it became clear that this was a turning point, a pivotal moment that would be remembered not for its ceremonial pomp, but for the intensity of its emotional stakes. William, maintaining his composure, allowed the silence to stretch further, a calculated move that emphasized the gravity of the moment. Observers would later speculate on the internal deliberations, the unspoken thoughts racing through his mind. Was this a test of Harry's sincerity? A measure of his willingness to respect the institution? Or was it simply a reflection of William's own need to assert authority, to protect the monarchy from what he saw as a reckless impulsiveness that could jeopardize everything he had worked to maintain? Every phrase Harry uttered was met with a measured pause, every gesture scrutinized. And yet, despite the tension, there was an undercurrent of familiarity, of shared history that neither brother could entirely ignore. The memories of childhood, of joint ceremonies, of family vacations, of moments of genuine affection, surfaced in fleeting flashes, reminding both of them that beyond the protocol, the public scrutiny, and the media frenzy, there was still a bond, albeit strained and fraught with unspoken grievances. But even the strongest bonds can be tested. Harry's plea, impassioned and raw, carried with it the weight of personal stakes, the looming shadow of public expectation, and the pressing question of legacy. And William, seated with unwavering poise, understood the complexity of the choice before him. It was not simply a matter of granting a request or denying it. Every action, every word, every decision would be analyzed, dissected, and remembered, both by the family and by the world that watched from afar. In the end, what happened in that room was more than a plea. It was a crucible. Harry's fall to his knees was not just a physical act, but a symbolic one, representing the tension between personal desire and familial duty, between vulnerability and power, between past mistakes and future possibilities. The room held its breath as the future king considered his response, aware that whatever he chose would send shockwaves far beyond the marble floors and gilded walls. And just as the tension seemed unbearable, just as it felt like the outcome could go in any direction, an aide knocked lightly on the door, signaling an interruption that neither brother had anticipated. William's eyes flicked toward the doorway, and in that brief distraction, a new element was introduced into an already volatile situation. A detail, a whisper, a hidden message that would change the course of the conversation entirely. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace has always been a place of appearances. Every smile, every wave, every carefully chosen word is meticulously calculated. But behind the grandeur and the ceremonial pomp lies a world of strategy, calculation, and secrets that the public rarely glimpses. And it is in that hidden world that Prince William, the heir apparent, operates with unparalleled precision. While Harry's knees had pressed against cold marble, his voice shaking with desperation, William had already been thinking 3 moves ahead. What the public would later call his decision was not spontaneous, not born out of emotion. It was the product of months, even years, of preparation, observation, and careful maneuvering. The moment Harry fell to his knees, William's mind was not in panic, not in sympathy. It was analyzing, calculating, measuring every possible outcome. How would granting Harry's plea affect the monarchy's image? How would it ripple through public perception, the tabloids, and even the royal household itself? Could he trust Harry to act responsibly if reinstated? And if he denied the request, what would be the fallout? Not just from Harry, but from advisors, allies, and the countless observers around the globe? William had learned early that emotion is a luxury in leadership. Decisions are tools of power, and in that moment, he wielded them like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, deliberate, and unapologetically effective. What many people don't realize is that William's preparation for moments like this did not begin yesterday. It began decades earlier, as a young boy watching his mother navigate the unforgiving world of royal scrutiny. He had internalized lessons about strategy, patience, and the necessity of maintaining appearances, even when the cost was personal. Every interaction with Harry since Megxit had been carefully noted, every public statement catalogued, every subtle shift in demeanor analyzed. By the time Harry knelt before him, William had already anticipated the arguments, the appeals, and the emotional pleas. He had rehearsed responses, not scripted, but mentally prepared, to ensure that he could maintain control while appearing measured, fair, and just. The hidden agenda was not malicious, it was calculated. William understood that granting Harry's return to active royal duties was more than just a familial gesture. It was a strategic choice that would set a precedent. Others in the royal family would watch, advisors would weigh in, and the public would scrutinize every detail. He knew that returning Harry to the fold without conditions could signal weakness. It could encourage others to challenge protocol, to question hierarchy, to exploit perceived leniency. In short, it could destabilize the very institution William was destined to inherit. And so, the hidden agenda began to unfold subtly, almost imperceptibly. William allowed Harry to speak at length, giving him the impression that his words carried weight, that his pleas were being considered. But in reality, William was observing, noting inconsistencies, evaluating sincerity, and mentally cataloging every vulnerability Harry displayed. Every emotional spike, every tear, every gesture of humility became part of a larger assessment, one that would inform the decision William ultimately made. At the same time, William had been working behind the scenes, consulting with senior advisors, palace aides, and confidants who had long guided him in matters of protocol and public perception. These conversations were discreet, off the record, and often undocumented, ensuring that the full scope of his strategy remained hidden from Harry. Some advisors had grown impatient with William's calculated approach, urging immediate resolution. Others recognized the genius of his patience, understanding that timing in moments like this is everything. A premature decision could backfire. A delayed response could manipulate perception, create leverage, and strengthen control. What was most striking about William's approach was his ability to merge emotional intelligence with strategic foresight. He was aware of Harry's feelings, aware of the personal stakes, aware of the sense of betrayal and isolation that had accumulated over the years. Yet, he did not allow empathy to cloud judgment. Instead, he used it as a tool, understanding that the perception of understanding could amplify Harry's vulnerability and create a position of advantage. It was a delicate balance, appearing compassionate while maintaining the upper hand, offering the illusion of choice while controlling the outcome. William's hidden agenda also extended to the public narrative. He anticipated leaks, subtle shifts in media coverage, and the likely framing of Harry's plea. He understood that the story would not remain confined to palace walls. It would leak, whether through trusted aides, journalists, or opportunistic insiders. By controlling timing, by carefully managing disclosures, William ensured that when the public finally learned the outcome, it would appear not only justified but inevitable. Every photograph, every statement, every carefully orchestrated smile or gesture was part of a broader strategy designed to protect both the monarchy and his own legacy. Meanwhile, Harry remained unaware of the depth of William's preparation. He assumed his vulnerability would be met with a measured, perhaps even sympathetic response. He believed that his sincerity, his evident remorse, would tip the scales in his favor. But William's silence, his deliberate stillness, was not uncertainty, it was control. Every second Harry spent pleading, every tear he shed, every word he uttered, was reinforcing William's position. And in that calculated quiet, the hidden agenda took shape, unseen but inexorably powerful. Adding complexity to this dynamic was the involvement of key palace aides and family confidants. William had instructed certain advisors to monitor, to document, and, when necessary, to intervene subtly without disrupting the delicate psychological interplay between the brothers. These aides understood the stakes. Some had served the family for decades and had witnessed similar moments of tension. Their loyalty was clear. They were there not to influence, but to provide support, counsel, and information. Yet even their presence added pressure, a silent reminder to Harry that the world was watching, even when he thought he was speaking in private. There was also a layer of psychological strategy at play. William understood that human decision-making is rarely rational, especially under stress. By allowing Harry to remain on his knees, by letting the tension stretch, William was leveraging cognitive pressure, amplifying anxiety, and subtly testing resolve. Every pause, every measured glance, every slight shift in posture was designed to evoke reflection, hesitation, and, ultimately, submission. In essence, William's hidden agenda was a masterclass in psychological strategy, executed with precision, patience, and foresight. And yet, there was a risk. The longer Harry remained desperate, the more unpredictable his behavior became. He might react emotionally, lash out, or take action that could undermine the monarchy or expose private fractures. William knew this risk existed, but he also understood that the potential reward, maintaining control, reinforcing hierarchy, and achieving a long-term strategic advantage far outweighed the temporary unpredictability. Every royal family member and advisor who later recounted the event noted the razor's-edge tension. One misstep, one emotional outburst, could have derailed the entire negotiation. Hidden within all of this was a deeper, almost imperceptible layer: William's understanding of legacy. This was not about punishing Harry. It was not about vengeance. It was about ensuring that the monarchy remained stable, respected, and credible. Every decision, every move, every silent calculation was in service of a vision that extended far beyond the immediate drama, a vision that considered history, public perception, family cohesion, and the inevitable passage of time. In that quiet, intense room, William was not just a brother confronting another brother. He was a future king preparing for a reign that demanded decisiveness, clarity, and above all, control. And just as Harry began to sense the depth of the challenge he faced, just as he realized that pleading alone would not suffice, William allowed a subtle shift in the room. A message was delivered, discreetly, to remind both of them that this was not merely a personal confrontation. Advisors were taking notes, confidants were observing, and the machinery of monarchy was quietly humming in the background. The hidden agenda was no longer abstract. It was taking form, ready to reveal itself in a way that would shock everyone involved. But what came next would alter the course of this confrontation entirely, exposing secrets, testing loyalty, and reshaping the relationship between the brothers in ways no one could have anticipated. In the world of royalty, the battles you don't see are often far more consequential than the ones the public does. As Harry knelt in the cold, calculated presence of his brother, Prince William, a quiet storm was brewing elsewhere, one that would determine not just the immediate outcome of Harry's desperate plea, but the very trajectory of the monarchy itself. The palace, vast and intricate, is not just a home. It is a microcosm of politics, ambition, and subtle power plays. And nowhere is this more evident than in the inner circle of advisors who surround the royal family, each wielding influence in ways most outsiders could never imagine. The advisors were split, a fracture hidden behind polite smiles and measured tones. On one side were those who saw Harry's plea as an opportunity to heal divisions, to restore public faith, and perhaps to soften the family's image after years of media scrutiny. They argued that a gesture of reconciliation could demonstrate empathy, humanize the monarchy, and mend a bond that had been strained by Megxit, media battles, and private misunderstandings. These advisors believed in strategy through compassion, recognizing that the world was watching, and that public perception could shift dramatically if handled correctly. On the other side were the hardliners, those who prioritized control, hierarchy, and precedent above all else. To them, granting Harry's request without stringent conditions would be a dangerous precedent. It would signal weakness, suggest that emotional appeals could override decades of training, protocol, and hierarchy. In their eyes, Harry's fall to his knees was less a plea for understanding and more a challenge to authority. These advisors feared that giving in could destabilize not only family dynamics, but the institution itself, emboldening other family members or peripheral figures to test boundaries, manipulate emotions, or exploit perceived leniency. Tensions between these two factions escalated quietly, behind closed doors, in private meetings, and in whispered conversations in dimly lit corridors. The advisors argued with subtle aggression, using facts, precedents, and hypothetical scenarios as weapons. Every detail was dissected: Harry's public statements, his private communications, his business dealings, even the subtle shifts in his tone when speaking to courtiers. Some advisors questioned his sincerity, citing past behaviors, his media strategies, and the potential for public missteps. Others emphasized the need for unity, for reconciliation, and for showing the world a family capable of empathy and adaptation. The war among advisors was not conducted with overt hostility. Rather, it was a battle of nuance, manipulation, and influence. Each advisor sought to frame the narrative in a way that would resonate with William, knowing that his decision would ultimately be shaped by the counsel he deemed most credible. Strategies included leaked reports, selective emphasis on Harry's vulnerabilities, and subtle reminders of the consequences of either choice. Every piece of information, every carefully phrased observation, was designed to shift the perception of reality within the palace walls. William, ever the strategist, observed all of this with clinical precision. He understood the motives behind every argument, the personal biases, and the political calculations at play. Some advisors sought to curry favor with him. Others were silently jockeying for influence in anticipation of the eventual outcome. The future king recognized that the advisors' war was both a reflection of the larger stakes and a microcosm of his own challenge, to navigate a landscape where loyalty, ambition, and perception intersected in ways that could either strengthen or weaken his authority. Meanwhile, Harry remained largely unaware of the full scope of this conflict. To him, the meeting was intensely personal, a desperate attempt to reconcile with a brother whose decisions had felt increasingly distant and opaque. He did not see the subtle maneuvers of courtiers, the whispered counsel, or the quiet calculations being made in the background. Every word he spoke, every gesture of vulnerability, was being evaluated, analyzed, and strategically interpreted. The room was a stage, but the advisors were the invisible directors, shaping the narrative without ever appearing on camera. Amidst this backdrop, a particularly contentious debate emerged regarding the optics of Harry's return. One faction argued that reinstating him as a working royal could be framed as a testament to family unity and resilience. They suggested carefully orchestrated public appearances, statements emphasizing reconciliation, and subtle gestures of familial warmth to sway public opinion. The opposing faction countered with equal fervor, warning that Harry's unpredictable media presence could overshadow any intended message, creating a scandal instead of a triumph. They cited past incidents, subtle missteps, and the risk of leaks that could magnify any miscalculation. The tension between these factions reached a crescendo when a senior advisor presented a dossier detailing potential public and private consequences of either decision. The room was filled with a quiet, tense energy as graphs, timelines, and strategic forecasts were reviewed. Each figure, statistic, and historical precedent became a weapon in the ongoing battle for influence. The advisors knew that William's attention could be swayed, that even the smallest detail could tip the balance. And so, arguments were crafted with precision, with appeals to loyalty, duty, and the weight of history. Humor, ironically, also played a role. In whispered asides, advisors mocked hypothetical scenarios, imagining Harry stumbling through formal duties or inadvertently causing diplomatic embarrassment. These moments of levity masked the seriousness of the stakes, but also reinforced the risk calculations being made. The laughter was quiet, subtle, yet it underscored the tension between emotion and strategy, between personal desire and institutional responsibility. As the debate raged on, another layer of complexity emerged. The advisors themselves were not monolithic. Alliances shifted, loyalties were tested, and hidden agendas influenced recommendations. Some advisors quietly communicated with external media sources, planting subtle hints designed to gauge public reaction or to manipulate perception. Others sought to shield William from external pressures, emphasizing confidentiality, control, and the importance of timing. The palace had become a chessboard, and every move, every whisper, every recommendation was part of a larger, intricate game. Meanwhile, William continued to observe, absorbing the arguments, weighing motivations, and considering implications. He understood that his decision would be interpreted not just by his brother, but by the advisors themselves, by other family members, and by a global audience. Each counsel offered insight, yet also risked introducing bias, manipulation, or unintended consequences. The challenge was to discern truth from strategy, sincerity from opportunism, and to make a decision that aligned with both family loyalty and monarchical duty. In the midst of this advisor's war, Harry sensed the mounting pressure, though he could not see its full scope. Every pause from William, every measured look, every brief moment of hesitation was amplified by his own desperation. He felt the weight of history, the gravity of expectation, and the invisible influence of the advisors whose loyalty and strategies shaped the very ground beneath him. The room became a crucible of tension, emotion, and calculation, with every word spoken or withheld carrying profound significance. Then came the subtle shift that no one expected. A small, almost imperceptible signal from an aide, a nod, a whispered phrase, a hand gesture, indicated that a faction within the advisors had taken decisive action. Information that had been carefully concealed, previously hidden reports and communications, suddenly entered the equation. The dynamic of the room shifted instantly. The advisors' war, which had been largely a contest of influence and argument, had now begun to produce tangible consequences, affecting not just perceptions but the unfolding decisions themselves. And as William registered this change, as the room held its collective breath, Harry remained unaware that the chessboard had shifted beneath him. What he perceived as hesitation, perhaps even empathy, was in reality a calculated response to a complex and evolving strategy. And in that moment, the stakes became even higher. Every word Harry spoke, every gesture of vulnerability, and every appeal for reconciliation would now be filtered through the lens of an ongoing, unseen battle that could decide not only his fate, but the legacy of the monarchy itself. But what came next would escalate tensions to a level no one could anticipate, exposing secrets, testing loyalties, and forcing choices that would leave the royal family and the world staggered. Silence can be more powerful than words, especially when it comes from someone whose presence alone commands authority. In the royal hierarchy, there is no figure whose silence carries more weight than that of the Queen. And during this escalating family drama, as Harry knelt and William weighed every word, every gesture, every flicker of vulnerability, the Queen's silence was deafening. It was not absence, it was presence in its most formidable form. Every member of the royal household knew that her observations were exacting, that her judgments were swift, and that she had an unparalleled ability to detect motives, truths, and deceptions that others might overlook. The Queen's role in this confrontation was not to intervene directly. She had long recognized the value of measured observation, of allowing the younger generations to navigate their conflicts while maintaining her own influence subtly. And yet, her very silence became a force that shaped the conversation, a quiet pressure that neither brother could ignore. William, ever aware of his mother's meticulous understanding of both family and public dynamics, found in her silence both support and challenge. He knew that every move he made was being watched, that the Queen's subtle gestures, the faint raise of an eyebrow, the nearly imperceptible shift in posture, could signal approval or condemnation. Harry, on the other hand, was acutely aware of the stakes, even if he could not see the subtle indicators. He understood that his kneeling plea was not just a personal appeal to William. It was, indirectly, an appeal to the entire monarchy, to the institution he had walked away from, and to the figure who symbolized both authority and continuity. He had grown up observing the Queen's public persona, the grace, the composure, the unflinching sense of duty, but nothing in his public memory could have prepared him for the intensity of the silence he now faced in private. The room, though physically small, seemed to expand with the weight of unspoken words. Courtiers and aides, positioned discreetly outside the chamber, later recalled the extraordinary tension, how the absence of verbal guidance from the Queen magnified every nuance of interaction. Every sigh, every pause, every glance became charged with meaning. William's measured stillness, Harry's vulnerability, and the Queen's silent oversight formed a triangle of tension so intricate that even minor gestures could have monumental impact. And then, there were the subtle communications, the couriers of quiet insight that flowed between the Queen and William. In the weeks leading up to this confrontation, she had provided counsel not through direct orders, but through private letters, discreet notes, and carefully framed conversations. These were guides, not mandates, and they allowed William to exercise discretion while understanding the broader implications of his choices. What William did in this room, in essence, was the product of preparation shaped by the Queen's guidance, yet executed with his own judgment and understanding of the delicate family dynamics. Harry, sensing that the silence itself carried meaning, attempted to fill it with words. He spoke of mistakes, of regrets, of missteps in judgment, of the yearning to return to the fold. But the weight of authority in the room, embodied both by William and by the invisible presence of the Queen, made every utterance feel both urgent and inadequate. He tried to convey sincerity, to appeal to shared history, to evoke memories of childhood innocence and familial bonds. Yet, he could not escape the feeling that his pleas were being measured not just for their emotional content, but for their strategic implications. Every line he delivered was under scrutiny, and every pause he took carried a silent commentary from the unseen observer, the Queen herself. The Queen's silence also served another, more subtle purpose. By not intervening directly, she allowed the brothers to navigate the complexity of their relationship independently, testing not only Harry's sincerity, but William's capacity for leadership, judgment, and diplomacy. It was a delicate balancing act. She could influence without controlling, guide without dictating, and observe without interfering. The result was a pressure cooker environment where every decision, every gesture, and every word carried amplified significance. Behind the scenes, palace aides monitored reactions, noting slight shifts in posture, microexpressions, and changes in tone. The Queen's presence, though physically absent from the immediate room, was felt everywhere, through the echoes of protocol, the reminders of duty, and the history that weighed on every participant. Advisors whispered among themselves, debating the potential outcomes and implications, but all were aware that the final judgment, whether direct or indirect, rested with her. In this high-stakes environment, the psychological tension intensified. Harry's desperation grew, his words increasingly impassioned, his body language betraying the strain of long-held regrets and the fear of permanent estrangement. William maintained his composed exterior, absorbing the pleas, weighing the stakes, and preparing to respond with the precision of a strategist who understood both the emotional and institutional consequences. The Queen's silence acted as an invisible referee, heightening the stakes without uttering a single word. Then came a moment that would later be described by aides as almost surreal. Harry, leaning forward, his voice quivering with a combination of pleading and frustration, paused mid-sentence as a faint, deliberate gesture caught his attention. The Queen, standing silently just outside the chamber, or so the aide suggested, had shifted her posture ever so slightly, a subtle signal that seemed to communicate more than words ever could. In that instant, Harry felt the full weight of history pressing down on him, the generations before him, the legacy of the crown, and the realization that this was far more than a personal plea. It was a confrontation with the very essence of monarchy itself. William, interpreting the gesture, understood the dual message, acknowledgement of the gravity of Harry's appeal, and a reminder that mercy, loyalty, and discipline must all be balanced with the demands of the institution. Every move he made from that point forward would reflect not just his own judgment, but also the weight of expectation carried silently by the Queen. It was a reminder that leadership is often exercised not through words, but through presence, perception, and carefully calibrated restraint. Harry's realization, however, was both humbling and terrifying. He understood that his fate rested not solely on his words, nor on his brother's immediate judgment, but on an intricate web of expectation, history, and silent observation. Every appeal had to resonate not only emotionally, but strategically. Every gesture had to convey sincerity without undermining his credibility. Every pause had to balance vulnerability with dignity. The Queen's silence had transformed the room into a crucible of decision-making, where the personal and institutional intertwined in ways both profound and inescapable. And just when the tension seemed unbearable, the first subtle intervention arrived. Not from William, not from Harry, but from the courtiers who had been discreetly observing the dynamics. A confidential message, passed with near-invisible precision, hinted at developments from outside the room. Leaks in the press, murmurs from distant family members, and strategic counsel that had previously been withheld. The silence of the Queen had set the stage. Now, the machinery of the monarchy, guided by unseen hands and carefully orchestrated strategy, was about to exert its influence. Harry felt the pressure mounting, the room shrinking around him as he realized the full complexity of the situation. William's measured presence, combined with the invisible weight of the Queen's judgment, created an environment where every choice mattered, every word carried consequence, and every misstep could be catastrophic. And yet, in the midst of this, the unseen observers, the advisors, the aides, and the Queen herself, prepared for a moment of revelation, a decision that would leave its mark on history. But what the Queen would do next, or not do, would shock everyone, forcing Harry to confront realities he had long avoided and setting in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. When private pleas fail to yield the response you hope for, sometimes the stage shifts to the public arena, and in Harry's case, the stakes could not have been higher. While the corridors of Buckingham Palace reverberated with silent tension and calculated glances, Harry's frustration, desperation, and need for validation were beginning to spill beyond the gilded walls. He realized that if he couldn't influence his brother and the advisors behind closed doors, the court of public opinion might serve as an alternative battlefield, a place where perception and sentiment could potentially sway outcomes in ways the palace could not fully control. Harry's public actions were deliberate, strategic, and yet tinged with raw emotion. Each carefully timed statement, interview, or public appearance was designed to convey a sense of regret, humility, and yearning for reconnection. But beneath the carefully curated narrative lay a simmering desperation. This was no ordinary media engagement. It was an attempt to force acknowledgement, to remind the world, and William, that he still existed, that he still mattered, and that he was willing to sacrifice pride to reclaim his place. The public quickly noticed a shift. Social media erupted with speculation. Headlines framed the younger prince's behavior as anything from earnest reconciliation to desperate stunt. Memes circulated depicting Harry on his knees, juxtaposed against William's stoic calm. Each post, each comment, each news segment amplified the tension, creating a feedback loop where Harry's actions influenced public perception, and public perception, in turn, pressured the palace. He was leveraging emotion on a global scale, a risky, audacious move that could backfire spectacularly or succeed in humanizing him in ways private negotiations never could. This new battlefield brought with it a series of unexpected complications. Every public word Harry uttered was scrutinized, dissected, and often misinterpreted. Former allies questioned his motives, critics mocked his vulnerability, and even neutral observers debated whether his actions were genuine or calculated. While Harry sought empathy, he also inadvertently provoked a storm of judgment and speculation. Every attempt to appeal to public sentiment carried the risk of reinforcing negative narratives, feeding tabloid sensationalism, or alienating potential allies within the monarchy. Despite the external scrutiny, Harry pressed forward. He participated in interviews, gave public speeches, and occasionally allowed glimpses of private anguish to surface. A slight tremor in his voice, a reflective pause during a televised event, or a candid comment about personal struggle became fodder for speculation and empathy alike. Observers noted a subtle irony. His attempt to regain favor within the royal family required him to navigate the very court of public opinion that had once been a source of resentment, a court he had previously criticized, mocked, and in some ways, fled from. At the same time, William and the palace staff watched closely. They understood that Harry's public desperation was both a strategic maneuver and a volatile gamble. Advisors analyzed every clip, every quote, and every social media reaction, crafting counter-narratives, refining public statements, and preparing contingency plans. The monarchy itself had become a reactive organism, adjusting to the unpredictable forces generated by one prince's emotional vulnerability. But the emotional weight of Harry's public desperation cannot be overstated. Behind every well-crafted sentence, every carefully staged appearance, there was a profound sense of personal crisis. Harry was fighting for his identity, his relevance, and his connection to a family and institution from which he had distanced himself. The public arena magnified every internal struggle, his longing for acceptance, his guilt for past actions, and the fear that his plea might be rejected entirely. Every smile, every furrowed brow, every hand gesture was a broadcast of internal turmoil. There were also subtle, behind-the-scenes repercussions. Allies who had previously supported Harry now found themselves caught in the crossfire of public scrutiny and palace politics. Some advisors worried that his public strategy might antagonize William further, reducing the likelihood of private reconciliation. Others believed that the exposure of vulnerability could force William's hand, compelling him to respond in a way that reconciled both family loyalty and public expectation. It was a delicate balance, a high-stakes negotiation played out on a global stage, where the audience was as influential as the actors themselves. Amid this storm, Harry attempted to reconcile conflicting impulses. He wanted to be seen as sincere, yet he also needed to demonstrate resilience. He needed to appeal for compassion, yet he also wanted to assert agency. Each public engagement was a high-wire act, a balancing of emotion, strategy, and timing. One misstep could be catastrophic. One misinterpreted gesture could undo months of careful planning. The pressure was immense, and the personal toll was equally significant. Yet Harry persisted. In moments of reflection, he recognized that public desperation was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allowed him to influence perception, to humanize his struggle, and to build pressure for reconciliation. On the other hand, it exposed vulnerabilities, risks, and criticisms that he could not fully control. Every public appearance became a negotiation, not only with the monarchy, but also with the global audience whose opinion could amplify or undermine his efforts. William, aware of the dynamics at play, observed with measured calculation. He recognized that Harry's desperation, while publicly visible, was part of a broader pattern of negotiation, both emotional and strategic. The younger prince was leveraging empathy, guilt, and media influence to create leverage. An understandable tactic, but one that William could manage with discipline, patience, and foresight. In essence, William's own strategy was reactive, measured, and designed to withstand the emotional and public pressures his brother introduced. And yet, despite his composed exterior, William understood that the stakes had risen. Harry's public desperation had introduced an unpredictable element, one that could not be entirely contained within palace walls. The advisor's earlier war had already laid the groundwork for tension. Now, the court of public opinion added fuel to a smoldering fire. Every media cycle, every social media post, every public analysis created new variables that William had to account for as he prepared to make his ultimate decision. In the midst of this, Harry's emotional state teetered on the edge. The combination of private rejection, public scrutiny, and the weight of familial expectation created a pressure so intense it could have broken the strongest individuals. Yet, Harry pressed forward, determined to assert his worth, to reclaim his position, and to secure a connection that he feared might be permanently severed. His public desperation was no longer just an act. It was a manifestation of internal turmoil, a vivid display of vulnerability that exposed both his strengths and his weaknesses. As tension mounted, a critical moment arrived. A televised interview, intended as a cautious appeal, suddenly became a lightning rod for speculation. A single phrase, interpreted in multiple ways by the media and public alike, sparked a flurry of headlines, social commentary, and palace discussion. For William and his advisors, it was a signal. Harry's public desperation had achieved visibility, influence, and pressure, but it had also introduced volatility. The next move would require precision, judgment, and the ability to navigate not only family dynamics, but also the unpredictable currents of public opinion. And as Harry left the stage, having poured his plea into the global spotlight, little did he know that the consequences were already unfolding behind palace walls. What appeared to be a simple attempt to appeal to empathy had, in fact, set in motion forces that would test loyalties, reveal secrets, and challenge assumptions. The world saw a desperate prince. William saw a complex strategy, a test of resolve, and a challenge to authority. And the tension, already thick, was about to reach a level neither brother could have anticipated. But what came next would create a shockwave through the monarchy, the media, and the public alike, changing everything Harry thought he knew about influence, loyalty, and power, and leaving both brothers teetering on the brink of irreversible consequences. The moment had arrived. Months of anticipation, countless whispered debates, and the tense negotiations of public and private perception had built to this single, defining instant. Prince William, heir to the throne, the man trained from childhood to balance power, duty, and legacy, now faced the culmination of a long, intricate process. Harry's desperate plea, the public's gaze, the advisor's quiet wars, and the Queen's silent oversight, all converged in one charged room. Every second mattered. Every gesture, every word, Every breath could tip the scales of history. William's face remained composed, betraying none of the storm that brewed inside. Outwardly, he was the epitome of poise, calm, and measured authority. Yet internally, his mind was a hive of calculation. He considered the broader consequences, the historical precedent, and the delicate balance of family and institution. What would granting Harry's request imply for the monarchy? How would it alter public perception? Could the younger prince be trusted to uphold responsibilities he had previously rejected? And if William denied the request, how would the world react? The future king weighed these questions carefully, knowing that the answer would shape not just the immediate moment, but the legacy of an entire dynasty. The advisors' arguments, which had dominated private corridors and hushed conversations for weeks, now crystallized in William's mind. He recalled every strategic recommendation, the factions urging compassion, the factions warning of precedent and risk, and the subtle cues from those whose loyalty was measured in nuanced gestures rather than outright declarations. The Queen's silent oversight remained an invisible force in the room, guiding his judgment without a word, a presence that reminded him of the weight of duty and history. Every consideration converged, and William prepared to act. The decision itself was not impulsive. It had been brewing in the shadows, shaped by months of observation, dialogue, and reflection. William knew that granting Harry's plea unconditionally would risk more than family dynamics. It could destabilize decades of carefully maintained hierarchy and protocol. Conversely, denying the request outright could appear harsh, inflexible, or unforgiving to the public, risking sympathy for the younger prince and criticism of William's judgment. He needed a solution that maintained authority, reinforced discipline, and preserved public perception, all while addressing Harry's plea in a manner that would minimize long-term disruption. And so, William's approach was surgical. He leaned forward, voice measured, tone deliberate, delivering words that were carefully constructed to balance firmness with acknowledgement. He validated Harry's feelings, recognized his struggle, and acknowledged the effort required to appeal. Yet, he simultaneously imposed clear boundaries, outlining expectations, responsibilities, and conditions that underscored the seriousness of reintegration into royal duties. It was not merely a decision, it was a framework, a path forward meticulously defined to ensure control, accountability, and predictability. The complexity of the decision was compounded by its symbolic significance. William understood that family reconciliation was only one layer. He was also communicating a message to the public, to advisors, and to the monarchy at large. Every word was intended to convey fairness, discernment, and authority. The calculus was delicate: show empathy without weakness, grant opportunity without undermining discipline, and maintain stability while signaling that loyalty and commitment remained non-negotiable. It was an intricate dance of perception, strategy, and emotional intelligence. Harry, for his part, absorbed every word, every subtle inflection, every carefully placed clause. His desperation had been tempered by hope, and now, as William's decision unfolded, he realized the stakes in their full magnitude. This was not a casual conversation between brothers. It was a formal negotiation, a test of character, and a public demonstration of the principles that underpin the monarchy. His pleading had achieved attention, but it was the manner of William's response that would determine the outcome, both personally and institutionally. The advisors, who had been monitoring and influencing the situation from the periphery, recognized the brilliance of William's approach. By imposing structured conditions, he had neutralized potential criticism from both factions. The hardliners, who would have opposed unconditional reinstatement, and the conciliatory advisors, who desired acknowledgement of Harry's plea. Every perspective had been accounted for, every potential argument anticipated. The decision was elegant, authoritative, and resilient, the kind of move that would endure scrutiny from family, public, and history alike. The public, unaware of the intricacies behind closed doors, would interpret the announcement in simplified terms. Headlines would highlight reconciliation, protocol, and responsibility. Social media would parse every word, seeking evidence of fairness, tension, or drama. Yet the true genius of William's decision lay not in perception, but in substance. The structural framework he imposed created a controlled path forward, one that allowed Harry an opportunity for reintegration while preserving hierarchy, discipline, and institutional integrity. Even so, the personal dynamics could not be ignored. Harry, kneeling moments earlier, now absorbed a decision that balanced opportunity with obligation. It was a lifeline, but one tethered to expectations, performance, and scrutiny. Every privilege would be contingent, every responsibility codified, and every misstep carefully documented. William's authority had been exercised with precision, and the gravity of it was not lost on the younger prince. Yet, as the words settled in the room, as advisors and courtiers absorbed the ramifications, a subtle tension lingered. This decision, brilliant in strategy and measured in execution, had consequences that even William could not fully predict. How would Harry respond? Would he accept the terms with humility and diligence, or would residual resentment and desperation undermine the carefully crafted framework? Would the public perceive fairness or manipulation? Every variable remained uncertain, and the palace itself held its collective breath. As the room prepared to move forward, a subtle, almost imperceptible signal arrived, a message, a whispered note, a minor adjustment in protocol that reminded everyone present that nothing in this drama was truly finalized. The palace, a world built on centuries of tradition, hierarchy, and observation, had shifted subtly, yet irrevocably. The calculated decision was made, but its execution, its reception, and its consequences were still unfolding.